Michael had never believed in ghost stories or urban legends. A civil
Thank you all
engineer
for
by
watching
trade,
and supporting
he
my
relied on
videos.
logic and facts
Your
to
encouragement
navigate
keeps
life.
me inspired
When
to
his car
create
slid
even
into
more
a
content.
ditch during a sudden
My next big
snowstorm
goal
on a
is to
remote
reach
mountain
1,000
road,
subscribers,
he thought his biggest
and I can't
problem
do
was
it
getting
without
a
your
tow
help.
truck.
If you
But as
enjoy
the
what I
wind howled
create,
and the snow
hit that
piled up,
subscribe
it
button
became
and
clear
join
he
me
had
on this
no
journey.
choice but to find
Now,
shelter.
let's dive into the
The only
stories.
building in sight was a house perched on the hilltop, barely visible through the thick curtain of snow. Its silhouette was eerie, tall, angular, and weathered by time. The kind of place you'd see in an old horror film. Michael hesitated but reasoned with himself, a roof over my head beats freezing to death. He grabbed his flashlight and trudged through knee-deep snow, every crunch of his boot swallowed by the storm. The door was slightly ajar. "Hello?" Michael called out as he stepped into the foyer. His voice echoed through the cavernous space, but there was no reply. The house smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. Dust clung to every surface, and the air was so cold he could see his breath. The walls were lined with old photographs, portraits of stern-faced men and women in 19th-century clothing. Their eyes seemed to follow him as he moved deeper into the house. Michael chuckled nervously. "It's just your imagination," he thought. He found a small sitting room with a dusty couch and an old fireplace. Grateful for the break from the storm, he decided to light a fire. The wood was surprisingly dry, and soon the room was bathed in flickering orange light. As he settled in, the house seemed to come alive with sounds. The creak of the floorboards above. The faint rustle of something in the walls. Michael brushed it off as an old building reacting to the storm. He leaned back, telling himself he'd leave as soon as the weather cleared. But then, he noticed the first odd thing. Above the fireplace was a large mirror, its surface warped with age. At first, he thought the reflection was just him, distorted by the glass. But as he moved, the figure didn't. It was a woman, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror, staring directly at him. Michael spun around, his flashlight beam slicing through the dark room behind him. No one was there. When he turned back to the mirror, the woman was gone. Over the next hour, the house became more oppressive. Shadows moved in his peripheral vision. Faint whispers came from the walls, just low enough that he couldn't make out the words. Upstairs, the sound of footsteps grew louder, heavier, as if someone, or something, was pacing directly above him. Michael tried to convince himself it was all in his head, but a growing dread gnawed at him. He decided he couldn't stay there any longer. Gathering his things, he made his way to the front door, only to find it wouldn't budge. The knob was ice cold, and when he looked closer, he saw frost creeping up the inside of the windows. It didn't make sense, the fire was roaring, yet the house was freezing. His breath came in rapid clouds as panic set in. And then he heard it, the faint sound of a child laughing. It came from upstairs. The laughter stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Michael stood frozen in place, gripping his flashlight so tightly his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded, each beat echoing in his ears. He told himself it was just the wind, some strange acoustics of the old house. But deep down, he knew better. He took a cautious step toward the staircase. Each creak of the ancient wooden floorboards beneath him felt deafening in the stillness. His mind raced with every possible explanation. Maybe it's a family who owns this place. Maybe it's a lost kid. Or maybe... He stopped himself. Thinking too much would only make it worse. The stairs groaned under his weight as he climbed. The flashlight's beam wavered, illuminating peeling wallpaper, warped banisters, and an unsettling amount of cobwebs. The air grew colder with each step, so cold that Michael's breath formed thick clouds, even in the supposed shelter of the house. At the top of the stairs, a long, narrow hallway stretched into darkness. Faintly, he could hear something, soft whispers, like a dozen voices murmuring at once. The sound came from the end of the hallway, where a single door stood slightly ajar. A dim light flickered inside, its source hidden. Michael approached cautiously, his steps slow and deliberate. The whispers grew louder. When he reached the door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. His mind screamed at him to turn back, to leave the house and brave the storm if he had to. But something compelled him forward, as if the house itself wouldn't let him leave until he opened that door. Taking a deep breath, he pushed it open. The room was empty. It was small, almost claustrophobic, with faded floral wallpaper and a single, cracked window. In the center of the room stood a child's rocking chair, its paint chipped and peeling. It was rocking back and forth, creaking rhythmically, though there was no breeze. Michael's flashlight beam trembled as he scanned the room. That's when he saw it, a doll lying on the floor near the chair. Its porcelain face was cracked, one eye missing, the other staring up at him with an unsettling intensity. The whispers stopped the moment he stepped into the room, replaced by a deafening silence. Michael crouched to examine the doll, an inexplicable sense of unease washing over him. As he reached out, a cold gust of air swept past him, slamming the door shut with a loud bang. He jumped, spinning around. The flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. And then he heard it again, the laughter. But this time, it wasn't distant. It was right behind him. Michael turned, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The doll was no longer on the floor. It was in the rocking chair, sitting upright, its head tilted slightly to one side. Its single eye seemed to gleam in the dim light, as though mocking him. "Who's there?" Michael demanded, his voice cracking. The room remained silent. Suddenly, the rocking chair stopped moving. The doll's head snapped forward with a loud crack, and Michael stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. As he backed toward the door, he felt something cold brush against his shoulder. He whipped around, shining the light in every direction, but there was no one there. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and indistinct. They seemed to come from the walls, the floor, even the air itself. Michael's chest tightened as panic took over. He bolted for the door, yanking it open and sprinting down the hallway. But as he reached the staircase, he stopped dead in his tracks. Standing at the bottom of the stairs was a figure. It was a woman, the same one he'd seen in the mirror earlier. Her pale face was streaked with tears, and her lips moved silently, as though she was trying to say something. But it wasn't her presence that terrified Michael, it was the dozens of shadowy figures standing behind her, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Michael stumbled back, nearly losing his balance. The woman's gaze locked onto his, her expression shifting from sorrow to anger. Her hand rose, pointing directly at him. The house shook violently, as though the very foundations were coming apart. The whispers became screams, filling every corner of the space. Michael turned and ran, blindly charging down the hallway in search of another way out. He didn't notice the child's laughter following him, growing louder with every step. Michael's legs burned as he ran, the weight of his fear pressing down on him like a vice. The hallway seemed endless, stretching unnaturally, as though the house itself were alive, twisting and contorting to keep him trapped. The whispers and screams merged into a deafening cacophony, and the faint, mocking laughter of the child echoed above it all. He spotted a window at the end of the hall, a way out. The glass was frosted over, but beyond it, he could see the storm raging. Better to face the cold than stay here another second, he thought. He charged toward the window, shoulder lowered, ready to break through. But as he neared, the shadows from the walls coalesced into solid forms, blocking his path. They weren't human, twisted figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths, their arms reaching out like claws. Michael skidded to a halt, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figures began to advance. Desperate, Michael swung his flashlight at them. The beam of light seemed to cause the shadows to recoil, their forms flickering like smoke. Hope surged within him. He pointed the flashlight directly at the nearest figure, forcing it back. But as he did, the light began to flicker again, the battery struggling to keep up. "No, no, no," he muttered, slapping the flashlight. The shadow surged forward, and Michael had no choice but to turn and run back the way he came. He burst into the main staircase again, the figures hot on his heels. The woman was still there, standing at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes filled with fury. But this time, she spoke. "Why are you here?" Her voice was a whisper, but it cut through the chaos like a knife. "You don't belong." "I just needed shelter," Michael shouted, backing away. "I didn't mean to leave," she interrupted, her voice rising, a cold wind whipping through the house. The shadows froze, retreating slightly, as though they feared her wrath. "But you must pay the price." "What price?" Michael asked, his voice trembling. "I'll do anything. Just let me go." She raised a hand, pointing to the doll that had somehow appeared at the bottom of the stairs. Its cracked face and single eye glared up at him. "Take it," she said. "And you will be free." Michael hesitated. Everything in his gut told him that touching the doll was a terrible idea. But the shadows were closing in again, and the woman's gaze pinned him in place. He had no choice. With shaking hands, Michael descended the stairs. The air grew colder with each step. He bent down, his fingers brushing the icy porcelain of the doll. The moment he lifted it, the house fell silent. The whispers stopped. The shadows receded. For a brief, blissful moment, Michael thought he was safe. But then, he felt it. The doll's head moved, ever so slightly, tilting to look up at him. Its mouth cracked open, and a childlike voice whispered, "You're mine now." The house shook violently, the floorboard splitting beneath Michael's feet. He stumbled back, clutching the doll, as the woman screamed, "Run! Before it's too late!" Michael didn't wait. He bolted out the front door, which now stood wide open, and into the blizzard. The storm howled around him, but he didn't stop. He didn't look back. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsing into the snow. When he woke, the storm had passed. A passing snowplow driver had found him and taken him to safety. Michael told himself it was over, that he had escaped the cursed house. But deep down, he knew it wasn't the end. The doll was still in his hands. In the weeks that followed, strange things began to happen. Doors in his apartment would slam shut on their own. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. And at night, he swore he could hear faint laughter, echoing from the corners of the room. Michael tried to get rid of the doll, burn it, bury it, even throw it into a river. But it always came back, sitting in its usual spot, staring at him with that single, mocking eye. No matter where he went, the house on Snowy Hill had claimed him. And now, it would never let him go. Emma was a travel writer with a penchant for seeking out remote, eerie places. Her blog, Wandering Shadows, thrived on mysterious destinations, and the stories about the house on Snowy Hill were too tempting to ignore. Locals spoke of vanishings, strange lights, and voices that carried on the wind. To Emma, it sounded like the perfect blend of folklore and mystery. Armed with her camera, a notebook, and a curiosity that often got her into trouble, Emma made her way up the mountain one late afternoon. The snow was fresh and unbroken except for her own footsteps. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the house came into view, a dark silhouette against the crimson sky. It was enormous, more mansion than house, with steep gables and broken windows. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving behind a skeletal, gray husk. Emma shivered, but not from the cold. The door creaked open easily, as if the house were expecting her. Inside, the air was stale, carrying a faint, metallic tang. The entryway was grand but dilapidated, an ornate staircase dominated the space, and tattered curtains fluttered weakly in an unseen breeze. Emma began snapping pictures, her camera's flash momentarily illuminating the shadowy corners. She tried to ignore the oppressive silence. The only sound was the crunch of snow still clinging to her boots. As she wandered deeper into the house, she noticed something strange. The temperature dropped dramatically, far colder than outside. Frost had formed on the interior walls, and her breath came in thick plumes. She tightened her scarf and pressed on, determined to explore every corner. In the parlor, she found the first real clue that something was wrong. A massive mirror hung above the fireplace, its surface fogged as though someone had just breathed on it. Emma wiped it clean with her sleeve, revealing her reflection, and something behind her. A figure, shrouded in shadow, lingered just over her shoulder. Emma spun around, but the room was empty. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had been in plenty of creepy places before. Old houses played tricks on the mind, especially ones with a reputation like this. "It's nothing," she told herself. "Just your imagination." Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. As the hours passed, the house seemed to come alive. Emma began hearing faint sounds, whispers that she couldn't quite make out, the soft creak of footsteps overhead. She climbed the staircase cautiously, her flashlight beam dancing across peeling wallpaper and empty picture frames. On the second floor, she found a child's bedroom. It was untouched by time, as though someone had just left. A small bed was neatly made, and a wooden rocking horse sat in the corner. Emma's camera clicked as she documented the strange scene. Then the rocking horse began to move. The motion was slow, deliberate. Emma froze, her camera hanging uselessly around her neck. She watched, transfixed, as the horse rocked forward and back, the creak of its wood cutting through the silence. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. The rocking stopped. On the wall opposite her, words began to appear in the frost-covered mirror. They formed slowly, as though an invisible finger were writing them, "Get out." Emma stumbled back, her pulse pounding in her ears. She turned to leave but found the door had shut on its own. She yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. A child's laughter echoed through the room, soft at first but growing louder. It came from everywhere and nowhere. Then, from the corner of her eye, Emma saw movement. A small figure darted past the doorway, a girl, no older than 7, her white dress stained with mud. Emma's journalistic instincts kicked in. She followed the child into the hallway, snapping pictures as she went. "Wait! I just want to talk," she called, her voice echoing in the empty house. The girl didn't stop. She turned a corner and disappeared into a room at the end of the hall. Emma hesitated but forced herself to follow. The room was a nursery, filled with broken toys and a crib draped in tattered lace. The girl stood with her back to Emma, facing the crib. "Are you okay?" Emma asked, taking a cautious step forward. The girl didn't respond. Instead, she turned slowly, revealing empty eye sockets and a wide, unnatural grin. Emma gasped, stumbling backward. The girl raised a hand and pointed at the crib. Against her better judgment, Emma stepped closer and peered inside. The crib was empty, except for a pile of snow. Buried in the snow was an old, rusted key. Emma grabbed the key, hoping it might open the front door. But as she did, the house erupted in chaos. The walls trembled, and a deafening roar filled the air. Shadows spilled out of the cracks in the walls, swirling around her like a living storm. She ran, clutching the key like a lifeline. The house seemed to shift and twist, the hallways leading nowhere. The whispers turned to screams, and the child's laughter echoed louder than ever. Finally, Emma found herself back in the foyer. She sprinted to the front door, shoving the key into the lock. For a terrifying moment, it didn't turn. Then, with a loud click, the door swung open. Emma stumbled out into the snow, gasping for air. The storm had cleared, and the night was eerily silent. When she turned to look back at the house, it was gone. All that remained was an empty hill, covered in untouched snow. To this day, Emma's photos of the house remain a mystery. No one else has ever seen the house on Snowy Hill. And yet, in the final photo she took, a small girl can be seen, standing in the distance, watching. Emma's heart raced as she stared at the last photograph, her breath fogging up the lens. The little girl in the distance, her empty eyes and eerie smile, wasn't something Emma could explain. No, she told herself, shaking her head, this can't be real. But the strange, gnawing feeling that had settled in her gut since leaving the house only grew stronger. The unsettling silence that had followed her departure from Snowy Hill seemed to follow her back into the city. It wasn't just the storm that had ended. Something had changed. She had never felt this way after leaving a place before. Days passed, but the unease stayed with her. Emma tried to convince herself it was just the adrenaline of a close call, but her nights were restless, plagued by dreams of that house. In them, the walls of the house were closing in, the whispers growing louder until they consumed her. She saw the little girl again, always standing in the corner of the room, beckoning her closer with that twisted smile. And then there was the strange feeling that the little girl was following her. It began with small things. Emma would return home after work to find her apartment door slightly ajar, though she was sure she had locked it. Once, her camera, which she had tucked safely on a shelf, was sitting on the kitchen table. When she checked her photos again, the last one, the one with the little girl in the snow, was gone. The space where the girl had stood was now filled with nothing but shadows. The unease turned into fear. Emma decided to visit the local library, hoping to find more information about the house on Snowy Hill. She sifted through old newspaper clippings, yellowed pages that told the same chilling tale over and over. There was nothing concrete, just whispers of disappearances and strange happenings in the town, all traced back to the house. And then she found something that made her blood run cold. A single article from 1924, its headline faded but still legible: "Tragedy strikes Snowy Hill, family vanishes without a trace." The article detailed the disappearance of the Hill family, the last known residents of the house. They had lived there for generations, and when they vanished, no one knew where they had gone. No sign of struggle, no bodies, just an empty house left behind. The authorities had searched for years, but the house remained abandoned. Until now. Emma's phone rang, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a number she didn't recognize. "Hello," she answered, her voice shaky. "Is this Emma?" a soft, strained voice asked. It was familiar, disturbingly so. "Who is this?" Emma replied, her pulse quickening. "I know what you saw," the voice whispered, the words sending a chill down her spine. "The house is still waiting for you." Before Emma could respond, the line went dead. The phone call only made things worse. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her. She was starting to lose track of what was real and what wasn't. Every time she turned a corner, she swore she could see the shadow of the little girl standing there, waiting. Her dreams grew darker. The house, the child, the whispers, they were all blending into one nightmare. Desperate for answers, Emma returned to Snowy Hill. But this time, something was different. The air felt heavy as she neared the hill. The house loomed larger, more menacing than before. The wind howled through the trees, as if warning her away, but she couldn't turn back now. She had to find out the truth. When Emma entered the house again, the door swung open with a loud creak, just like before. The air was colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, as though the house itself were alive. She walked cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. But this time, the house didn't feel abandoned. It felt aware. She wandered through the halls, the whispers of the past filling the air. The child's laughter followed her from room to room, each time growing louder and more frantic. At the top of the stairs, she froze. There, standing at the end of the hallway, was the little girl. She was no longer a distant figure. She was real, standing in front of Emma, her eyes hollow and her smile unnaturally wide. "You came back," the girl said, her voice a high-pitched whisper that seemed to echo in Emma's mind. "I didn't mean to," Emma stammered, her legs shaking. "What do you want from me?" The girl's smile widened. "You never left," she whispered. "You're one of us now." Before Emma could react, the walls of the house began to shift. The air grew thick with fog, and the room seemed to stretch impossibly. The little girl reached out a hand toward Emma, and with a rush of cold air, Emma felt herself being pulled forward. In that moment, Emma knew she had no choice but to follow. The house had claimed her. The walls closed in, and the voices, now clearer, stronger, filled her mind. As she walked deeper into the heart of the house, Emma realized that she wasn't the first to be claimed by the house on Snowy Hill. The faces of those who had vanished, their eyes empty and hollow, stared back at her from the walls. They were trapped, just like her. The last thing Emma saw before the darkness overtook her was the little girl's face, now grinning wider than ever, as she whispered in Emma's ear. "You're home now." The next morning, the house was once again empty. The snow had begun to fall, covering the hill in a fresh, untouched blanket. And deep inside, hidden from the world, the whispers began again. Days passed, and the town had returned to its peaceful, unassuming rhythm. No one had heard from Emma since she ventured back to Snowy Hill, and her disappearance had become just another whispered tale, added to the countless others of people who had gone missing near the mountain. But there was one person who didn't let go of the mystery. Luke, Emma's close friend and fellow writer, had known about her obsession with the house on Snowy Hill. He had always warned her against it, but she'd never listened. When he received the last cryptic message she had sent, a hastily typed email that ended with, "It's not what I thought. I need to get out, but I can't," Luke knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to find Emma. Armed with only his journal, camera, and determination, Luke made his way up the same snow-covered mountain Emma had climbed. The wind howled, the bitter cold biting into his skin as he approached the looming silhouette of the house. It stood as it always had, silent, waiting. Luke hesitated at the threshold, the door creaking open by itself as though expecting him. He stepped inside, the familiar chill settling over him. The house seemed quieter now, as if it had consumed all of its energy, waiting for its next victim. "Emma?" Luke called softly, his voice barely rising above the howling wind outside. His flashlight flickered as he moved through the entryway. The house felt different, darker. The walls seemed to shift around him, as though the house was breathing, shifting with each step he took. He found the first clue in the parlor, just like Emma had. The broken mirror, still hanging above the fireplace, was now clear, its surface unmarred by frost. But as Luke looked into it, his reflection was gone. Instead, the figure of a little girl appeared, standing behind him. She smiled, her empty eyes watching him with a knowing gleam. Luke spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no one there. But something in the corner of the room caught his eye, an old photograph, slightly burnt around the edges, lying on the floor. He knelt down and picked it up, recognizing the familiar faces of Emma and herself, both standing in front of the house. But what disturbed him most was the girl beside them, standing too close to the camera, her eyes shadowed and her smile too wide. As he moved further into the house, Luke's anxiety grew. The house seemed to shift around him. The walls were whispering now, low and muffled, like distant voices from another world. He heard Emma's voice faintly, pleading, "Luke, please. I need you." His stomach turned. He had to find her. At the end of the hallway, Luke found what he had been looking for, a room where the floor was covered in frost. And there, in the middle of the room, stood the little girl again. This time, her smile had faded, replaced by a cold, empty stare. "Where is she?" Luke demanded, his voice shaking. The girl didn't respond. She merely pointed toward the far corner of the room. When Luke followed her gesture, he saw it, a large, ornate mirror, unlike the others. It was covered in frost, its surface cloudy and distorted. He could feel it pulling at him, calling to him. He stepped forward, his breath shallow. As he reached out to touch the mirror, the frost cracked, and with a jolt, the surface cleared. What he saw on the other side was not the house, but an endless expanse of swirling fog. Emma was standing in the midst of it, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She reached out to him, her voice now clear and desperate. "Luke, don't come in. It's too late. It's too late for both of us." Luke's heart raced as he reached out to her, but just as his fingers brushed against the mirror's surface, everything went dark. When the town awoke the next morning, the storm had passed. The sun rose, casting light on Snowy Hill. But when the locals went about their day, they noticed something strange: the house was gone. The snow had covered the land, and nothing remained but the untouched hill. As the years passed, the stories of the house on Snowy Hill faded into myth. People still whispered about the disappearances, the eerie coldness, and the strange girl that haunted the hill. But no one dared to search for it again. And somewhere, far beneath the snow, the house waited. Its whispers echoed in the wind, and its walls called out for more souls to claim.